right, so we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is John Patenia. I'm the Program Director for the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health. For those of you who are new here, the Center for Digital Health is an academic medical center that's dual affiliated with Brown University and Lifespan Healthcare Systems, which is the largest hospital system based in Rhode Island. One of our goals is to provide educational seminars to the general public to discuss different digital health tools, products, and services, research studies that goes on around the country and around the world. And we host these seminar series on a monthly basis. And we're so pleased to welcome Dr. Michele Ybarra here today. So Dr. Ybarra is recognized as a public health researcher with a focus on technology-related health issues for young people. She has led the development and evolution of multiple text messaging-based behavior change programs on a variety of topics, including smoking cessation, healthy sexuality, and bullying. So Dr. Ybarra will be talking about designing and evaluating engaging mHealth behavior change programs for youth. Dr. Ybarra, thank you so much. It's such an honor to have you join us here today. I will hand things over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here with you all. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Relatively seamless. Hopefully that bodes well. All right. Well, when I talked to John about what it is that he wanted me to focus on, I said, we could talk about recruitment. We could talk about, intervention development or the results. And he said, all of those things. So I'm going to try and talk about all of those things. And it'll be kind of an eclectic conversation. And hopefully by the end, it will come together and you'll have an idea of sort of how we do what we do. So it's not wanting, there we go. Okay. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think it's helpful to spend a minute to talk about why technology. So we do a lot of work with young people, and I think when doing that, technology just makes a ton of sense. Most of our work is text messaging based, and that's because more than 9 in 10 young people have a phone. And text messaging is the preferred mode of communication. So they don't really want to talk on the phone. They don't really necessarily even want to video chat. DM, direct messaging, is really generally what they prefer to do. And also, importantly to me and others, I think, who are concerned about health disparities, there seems to be equivalent access to cell phones by race and ethnicity, by rural versus urban, and by low versus middle versus high income people. And so it really is a way to reach a diversity of young people across geographic locations. There's quite a few additional advantages of technology, unlike interventions that are difficult to take. You have a group of young people, it's really not appropriate to be like, so Bob, this is what I want you to be taking away from this intervention, but Susie, for you, this is what you should be hearing, right? But when you're doing a technology-based intervention, what you can do is send those specific and targeted messages based on one's characteristics, and yet have sort of the main meta messages go to everybody, and therefore continue to have program fidelity. The content can be more engaging and less didactic. Just like in-person interventions, it depends on the facilitator. Some facilitators are amazing and some could not be more boring. The same is true for the content for technology-based interventions. So there's the opportunity to really reach and engage young people in that way. And I think also it's an opportunity to talk about important, hopefully health behavior changing content in ways that reduce discomfort and embarrassment, because you can talk about them in a one-on-one experience, as opposed to this group experience where you feel like everybody else is watching you and judging you. Now it's just you and your phone. Certainly scalability is another advantage, being able to disseminate this intervention to everybody across the country versus thinking about, okay, now we did it in one school, how do we take it to the rest of the school district, right? The scalability is easier with technology in some ways. I think the anonymity and the safety for me, are kind of the key advantages for technology, particularly with young people. We just talked about embarrassment. I think being able to engage with and access really sensitive but important health information without anyone else knowing that you're part of the program, right? Doing it anonymously and doing it where and when it's safe for you. The way technology interventions can be delivered, you can really empower the person on the other end of the screen to decide when they're going to open that text message or when they're going to go through that module and where they're going to be when doing it. I think also technology overcomes important barriers, transportation, scheduling, time constraints, all of these other issues. You think about teen parenting programs, and this teen is somehow supposed to get herself or themselves over to your program so you can do this in-person thing when she's got so many other things going on. And I also think intervention pace. So while it's difficult for in-person interventions to, go back and review if somebody wants to go back and review, but keep going forward if somebody wants to go forward, when it's technology-based, young people and people in general have the opportunity to go back and scroll through earlier messages. If it's module-based, they might have the opportunity to choose which module is most resonant to them at that moment. And I think that kind of tailoring is really empowering. I am the first to say that technology is not a panacea, and there are absolutely, populations and other reasons why technology may not be the right way to go for what you're trying to achieve. And I think sometimes it's tempting because it's kind of sexy to use technology. It's tempting then to use it for everyone in every case. And I think it's really important to be able to articulate the why for your population. One of the things that technology requires is self-motivation. So you think about, again, that the school-based intervention, well, all those kids are there, right? They don't have to be interested. They don't have to buy into what it is that you're trying to talk about. They just have to be in their seat. And in some cases, for some topics, that's a really important, powerful thing. For technology, young people and people have to say, tell me about this thing. I want to sign up, right? All of you are here today because you signed up. So there has to be a reason why the person is going to be self-interested in the health behavior change in order to make this technology-based delivery work. I think with the pandemic, we, were faced with the fact that the digital divide is painfully real. And so if we are going to use technology tools, then we need to pick them based upon who it is we're trying to reach and what then their technology access is. So the access to text messaging is different than the access to the internet and app-based interventions. And app-based interventions can be a great tool depending on your population. And, again, the technology is a very wide swath of opportunities. We just need to be mindful of the fact that the digital divide can impact our access to particular populations. There are important ethical issues also that need to be considered that are unique to technology. For example, identifying and referring young people who are in crisis. If you're face-to-face with them, you have the opportunity to kind of, physically walk them over to a mental health clinician, and you can't do that when you're on the other side of the screen. And so thinking about then, how are you going to affect that in a way that then promotes young people's safety? So while it is cost-effective to scale technology, it also is very expensive to develop it. And so what that means is that your development costs for an intervention that's technology-based that goes to one person is basically the same as going to 1,000 people. And that's very different from sort of more traditional intervention development, where your costs typically are on the back end when you're ready to scale. And so that actually makes it more difficult to get pilot data because it is so expensive to actually develop and do all the front end work. I think another challenge is really to determine what is fad versus transcendent. And those of us, who are old enough to remember MySpace and when we were scrambling to develop something that could be delivered on MySpace, and by the time those were up and ready to go, people had already migrated to Facebook. And so then we moved to Facebook, and by the time things were up and ready to go, people had already migrated elsewhere. And so really trying to identify maybe less the platform and more what are the tools, what are the transcendent tools that are going to be used in terms of communication and potentially delivery modes over time. So I've had the opportunity to develop mostly text messaging based, some internet-based interventions across a variety of health topics and across a variety of target populations. Typically, we focus on adolescents, so kind of 14 to 18 years of age. We've done some work with young adults. We've done some work with adults 18 and over. And so what we'll do today is talk about some examples across these various projects so that you can kind of see how they can, things can be applied across different topics and target populations. So across the work that I've done, I've kind of come up with a list of sort of, do's and don'ts that have worked for me. So I more than anything, less text is more, less is more, which is really hard because we have so many ideas and we just want to say all of the things, which is great. But if you aren't able, like if your eyes are glazing over when you're reading your own content, don't expect other people to take the time to read it either. If you can say it in fewer words, do. Don't preach, don't pester. And I think we know this, but sometimes it's hard to remember that when we're so passionate about what it is that we're writing. And so just being mindful of the tone and making sure that we're not sounding like we have our finger wagging in the background. I think another important thing is to not try and sound like their friend. Particularly for young people, it's just the quickest way for them to tune out. So when I want to use voice, what I'll do is use testimonials, and I'll give some examples of that in a minute. But essentially, I will say something like, I talked to a teen and a teen told me this, and that gives me the opportunity to use their voice without trying to affect it and pretend like it's coming from me. Everyone loves inspirational quotes. Across all projects, across all topics, across all age groups, everybody loves inspirational quotes. It doesn't have to be related to what you're talking about. In fact, it's kind of nice if it's not. And it just gives everybody a moment to have a warm fuzzy and a breather, because often we're talking about some pretty heavy stuff. Another really important thing that I've found is the target population knows better. So we do quite a bit of work talking to our target population, but also talking to experts. And there have been multiple times where the target population will tell me one thing and the experts will be like, oh, I don't think they're ready for that. I don't think they'll understand that. And then you go back and you're like, so what do you think about this content? And they're like, oh, that really works for me. And so really preferencing what the target population is saying, because they truly are the experts in this area. If I like to develop relationships with my content so that young people feel like there's somebody coming alongside them in the program. And so if you do that, then you have to expect an interaction. And so one of our earlier text messaging programs, Guy to Guy. And so the first message is like, hey, Bob, this is Riley. I'm so excited you're here. And then we move on and talk about the program and move into the program. And it wasn't until, a couple of months later that we were able to catch up with the launch and have a monitoring system that allowed us to see the messages that they were messaging back to us. And one of the things that we saw right away was that Bob was really excited too. And so Bob would respond and be like, hey, Riley, I'm excited too. But we didn't expect that in the program. And so the way that it was written, they got an error that essentially was like, error, I don't know what you're trying to tell me. And so the very first interaction was very clunky. Now, thankfully, they stuck it out and we were able to move through it. But expecting an interaction, making sure that that is actually part of what's programmed into the intervention behavior is super important. Do an internal test. Because if you aren't willing to do the 8 weeks or the 5 hours or whatever it is that you've designed, you have to be willing to do it because your heart is in it. And if you're not willing to do it, there's no way anybody else is going to hang in for the entire thing. So do it. You'll also learn quite a bit about, what you want to change, but making sure that it's resonant enough for you and everybody else on the research team, I think, is a really important litmus test. And the last thing I'll say is that, use a theoretical model. I think now we've been doing this for a while, so it's feeling a little bit less like the Wild West. But just because what we're doing is new and hopefully innovative, that doesn't mean that we don't already have ideas about how we need to, what are the components of health behavior change that we really then can translate into this technology delivery. So these are the steps that we go through for every single project, even if it's related to something we've done before, even if it's a population we've worked with before. Every single time we do these things, we start with focus groups because there are always questions that we have that could be answered with our target population. And I also do focus groups so that I can get voice, so that I can hear from the target population how they're thinking about these things, how they're talking about these things. And then I'm able to use that when I'm writing my content. And then I'll have experts review the content. And, if there are topics that they think need more work or, that are missing or that need to be added, that's that time. And then I move then to teens, the target population, and ask them to give me their feedback on the content. How is it working for them? And then we do the alpha test, which is that internal teen test that I just talked about, and do the beta test, which is sometimes called a pilot. I have found that if we don't do a beta test, we de facto do a beta test because there are so many things that we actually thought were working that weren't. And so once we've done all of those things, then we do the RCT, and then afterwards we do the interviews to see how it went with the target population. So I'm going to talk about some of those steps a little bit more in depth to give you an idea of what these things look like. Focus groups to me are the key, the meat of the whole entire thing, because focus groups drive my content, and content is everything. If you have great content, people will stay with you throughout any unimaginable technology snafu. We once messaged people 100 text messages within 2 hours. It was horrible, but they stuck in. But if you have an intervention that's super shiny and fancy, but without content that's engaging, they're not going to stick with you. And from my perspective, focus groups are really the way to get you set up for success. So for us, focus groups tend to be the first opportunity to also work out some of these things that are critical to doing research well. And so, as I mentioned, there's sort of technology-based we need to be thinking about. And when working with kids, that's especially true. And so these are the things that we typically use and to scaffold a safe experience for our young people. For all NIH projects now, a certificate of confidentiality is automatically issued. So that's always in place if you're funded by NIH. If you're not funded by NIH, you can still apply. They will issue a certificate of confidentiality to you. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention will do the same if you have reason to have one, and it's a pretty low bar. Basically, anything that you're doing, if it has the potential to place somebody's reputation or safety in harm, you can get a certificate of confidentiality. We also often ask for a waiver of parental permission from the IRB. That's because we're working with vulnerable populations, we're working on sensitive topics, and I want my young people to be empowered to talk to their parents if they want to, and sometimes they do, but not required to, because it's not always a safe space. And I want young people to be able to use the same decision-making that we ask them to do every day when they go to school, when they go home. They have to make some decisions about what's going to be safe and what's going to be unsafe. And so I want to partner with them in that regard here as well. We do our enrollment over the phone. So you have to have a conversation with us, a live actual conversation with us to get into our programs. And that's because we have this waiver of parental permission. I want to make sure that you are hearing all of the things that are important to know before you start doing a project with us. It gives us the opportunity to discuss the assent. We also do a capacity to assent. I know many of us on this call do, and that's just sort of a stop point where you ask a couple of questions to make sure that the person is understanding key components, right? Like the voluntariness, the risk and benefits, the types of things. We also do what I call a self-safety assessment, which then takes the young person into a space where we ask very concrete questions that are tailored to the intervention experience to make sure that they are thinking about what might happen if somebody finds out that they're in this program. So for example, if we're doing focus groups, we will ask, okay, so what happens if somebody comes into the room and sees words like penis and sex toys on your screen, on your computer screen or on your phone? What if it's your mom? What if it's your partner? What if it's your brother or your sister? What's going to happen? We just finished a pilot for HIV home-based testing. And so that self-safety assessment was much more geared around, okay, so if somebody sees a package on your front porch that has your name on it, what's going to happen? Are they going to ask questions? What do you need to be thinking about? If somebody opens the package and finds an HIV test, what's going to happen? What can we be thinking about together? And if during this conversation, they begin to say things like, well, gosh, I don't know. I don't know if I would be safe in that way. I think my mom might actually be really upset. I think my partner might be jealous. Then, we can talk about whether or not there are ways that we can mitigate risk. But ultimately, if it's not safe, then we don't close the door, but we do say, it sounds like now is not the right time. And that maybe in the future, you might be in a safer place to take part in this program. But for right now, it really feels like this is the safer choice for you. So in addition to having the ethics scaffold, we then start thinking about recruitment. And we tend to do our recruitment across the country. That's to really take advantage of technology, right? If we can have the potential to reach all the kids across the United States, then I want to start doing that from the beginning, because I want to make sure that my intervention is developed with voice and with the feedback from young people across the country. So to do so, we use social media to recruit. And in order to recruit effectively on social media, you need to have a social media presence. And so here is an example of a post that we just did on our Project Shag page. And so Project Shag is targeting sexual minority boys and young men. We also create social media ads that are fun, engaging, and cute. And we'll see if I have the power to turn this on. Let's see. So this obviously has nothing to do with an intervention or health or anything, but that doesn't matter because this is one of our highest performing ads, right? People are going to click on something that is engaging. This has that TikTok sort of sound, really trying to understand what is going to reach and engage your population as opposed to what's going to, feel good to you. When people reach out and say, hey, Michele, I'm having some trouble recruiting on social media. Can you give me some pointers? I'll say, yeah, let's take a look at your ads first. And often, we need to work on the image because the image probably may not be something that, people are excited about. We often need to work on the text because we're using research language, right? Like take part in an HIV prevention program. I would never say that because teens don't want to do an HIV prevention program, but teens want to talk about sex and they want to talk about relationships. And so those things are not unrelated to what I want to talk about. And so I message about things that they might be interested in so that we can get them in the door and talk about what we might all be talking about together. There we go. Okay, so here is an example of what our focus group data look like. So we do asynchronous online focus groups. We've been doing them for years, before COVID, after COVID. We do them asynchronously so that, so what that means is that it's basically bulletin board style. Young people come in, they see messages posted, they post their response. Sometimes they talk with each other, and then they go away and then they come back. It's a 3-day experience. We do it this way so that young people can log on when it's safe for them, when it works for them, and that they can, engage in a way that is also safe. So while required a phone call, we recognize that that's a higher level of burden for safety than just being able to type, right? Because if you're doing something audio, then you have to make sure that nobody around you can hear you, whereas typing just is easier, an easier threshold. So for Transcendent Health, this is an HIV prevention program for 14 to 18-year-old trans girls and other gender diverse youth. That we are currently developing and then we'll be evaluating. And so one of the things that we talked about was that there's some emerging research, there's not great research yet, but emerging research that suggests that trans girls are at higher risk for HIV than other young people. And so we wanted to get their reactions. We wanted to think through with them why they think that might be the case. And here are some of the things that they shared with us. And I will say another benefit to the way we do our focus groups is that these are literally what they typed in. So there's no transcription, there's no interpretation. It's literally in their words. So one teen said, I think they might be getting STIs because sexual wellness and safety isn't very much talked about when it comes to LGBT plus teens. So they aren't receiving the proper education about staying safe. So sex ed and the lack thereof. And this was echoed by another person who said education. We have no idea what applies to us, what doesn't apply to us, et cetera. I only know because of the internet. Also, since queer youth tend to be more likely to be in poverty and homelessness, the higher rate of HIV in those living in poverty with homelessness crossed over here. They might engage in risky behavior just to stay alive. And so one of the things that's really important and powerful in doing this work is that it just is such a great reminder of how thoughtful young people are, that they are thinking about, aware of, and wrestling with really big stuff. And so we need to acknowledge that in our content, and we need to be willing to go there with them. We also wanted to know a bit more about, when and why and where trans kids are choosing to have sex and not, so that when we're talking about those types of issues and how to negotiate condoms and how to talk about what you want in when you're having sex really resonates in a way with the population. And so when we talked to trans kids about it, one of the words that came up quite a bit to describe their feelings was dysphoria. And so one teen said, it's hard to feel sexy when there's this thing about your body you want to change. And another teen said, there's a lot of judgment and denial of my identity coming from the people who don't accept my gender identity. It makes me feel ashamed, not just to have the sex that I want to have, but also to be who I am. It feels wrong sometimes, like that by being myself or having sex, I'm doing something I shouldn't be. So there's a lot there that we need to be sure we're working to unpack in our intervention. I think it's important too to give young people the opportunity to express joy and positive experiences, affirming experiences. And so one teen shared, as for sex, hearing my boyfriend gender me correctly and use my preferred name really heightened the positive impact of our relationship. This made me more open to disclosing my full sexual needs, and this made us more close as a couple. And a lot of teens in these focus groups talked about being gendered correctly, being misgendered, and the impact that had on them. And so here are examples of some messages that were written directly as a result of those focus groups. So unhealthy relationships. One girl told me, when someone deliberately misgenders or dead names you, it's like a stab in the side. You don't need me to tell you this is not healthy. And so that's an example of where we pulled in a direct quote and used it as a testimonial so that I'm able to use words from the focus groups without making it seem like they're words that I'm saying. We did the same thing for violence in the relationship. One girl told me her boyfriend would pressure her into having sex and then was rough and hurtful. She figured this was for her cheating. So that's what one of the teens said in the focus groups. And by bringing that into the content, that hopefully gives me an opportunity to share something that feels realistic and opens up the door to talk about unhealthy relationships and how to try and navigate them. let's go through one more example of focus groups driving content, because I think, as I said, it's sort of very much key to what we're doing here, and then we'll move on. So SHAG, Sexual Health for All Guys, is the HIV prevention program for cisgender sexual minority boys. Here, what we wanted to ask about was the home-based testing and what that might look like, and also PrEP and PEP. And so it was interesting to hear the various views about why they might prefer to do the HIV test at home versus the clinic. And in fact, I thought most would want to do it at home because of the sort of anonymity. But in fact, most said they wanted to do it in the clinic because they were worried about doing it wrong. They wanted it to be accurate. They understood how important the result was going to be, and they wanted to be sure that if it showed up anything unexpected, that it wasn't because they, put the wrong thing in the wrong thing. When we talked about PrEP and PEP, one of the things that came through was that many teens now have heard about PrEP, which is great. Very few had heard about PEP. So that signals to me that, in the content, that's sort of where we can come from. We can kind of come at it with an understanding that most folks have heard about this. And so we're going to spend a little bit more time educating about PEP. And when we were talking about access and barriers to access, many teams talked about the disclosure to caregivers being a problem. And it wasn't just the teens, right? When I talk about teens, the 14 to 18-year-olds, it also was the 20 and 21, 22-year-olds who were still on their parents' insurance. And they were like, gosh, I don't think that's going to go well. Now, that's not to say all parents were not a positive support. Several did say, I think that would be okay. I have the kind of relationship with my mom. She cares about my health. If she saw it on the insurance, we would just have a conversation about it. And so again, it was really helpful to see both and to hear both perspectives so that both then can be reflected in the content. It also was really helpful to be reminded that when we're talking about condoms, many of, I'll call them old school barriers that I feel like we've been trying to address, for decades still resonate. So the embarrassment and feeling like you might bump into somebody that at the store, that could be, worse than getting an STI, basically, right? That would be the reason not to get a condom. And also really trying to further contextualize some of our content that we already had by asking if there were sociocultural factors that we could address a little bit better in this context. So here are some examples of where that focus group voice went with the messages that we made. So one said, maybe you're not dating, but he seems trustworthy and gives you good vibes. There's no reason why condoms or PrEP can't fit into the equation too. We were hearing that for PrEP, one of the reasons why guys might not use PrEP is because they're in a committed relationship, right? The same reason why they're not using condoms. And so trying to get in front of that, but in both addressing condoms and PrEP. Some guys don't use condoms because their friends don't, or because it's just not common where they live. Be your own individual, the individual who uses condoms, that is. Another example, know that for both PEP and PrEP, you do not need your parents' permission in most states. That was something else that, a lot of teens were concerned about. But if on their health insurance, they will get the bill. We want to be sure that they know that this can be a choice that in many states they can make on their own, and yet also there may still be disclosure. So once we develop the content, we then do the expert content review, and then we do the content advisory teams. And this is when we go back and we recruit a new set of people from the target population, and we ask them to review our content and to, like, line by line kind of tell us what they like and what they don't like. And, when we did these with Guy to Guy, which was over a decade ago, at the time, there really wasn't a whole lot of research out there with sexual minority adolescents under 16. And what we learned was that really sexual minority guys were very happy to give us our feedback. They just wanted to be asked. They just wanted to be seen. And so their enthusiasm was super great. One of the other things that we learned was to do more than one cat. So we did a cat. I integrated all the feedback into the content. I was feeling really good about it. We did a second cat, and it looks like I overcorrected on some things, right? I had one teen on the first cat say, no emojis. I hate emojis. There's so many emojis. Get rid of the emojis. And then in the second cat, they were like, where are the emojis? Why aren't you happy? Right? And so just making sure that that you do that second review so that you're able to make sure that you're not attending to one very articulate human being and have changed your content in very important ways. And then, as with all human beings, teens prefer being supported. And so making sure that that is the tone that they're hearing, and when they're flagging it, to update the tone when they feel otherwise. In general, we get really positive feedback, and it's always really nice to get warm fuzzies, right? But we also really do get helpful ideas about how to improve the content. So in Girl to Girl, which is our teen pregnancy prevention program for sexual minority cisgender girls, they really wanted our messages to be more gender inclusive. So this assumption that if you're having sex with a penis, it must be a guy, they said, no, that is not what we're doing here. And so we were able to go back and make sure our messages were more inclusive. In Transcendent Health, our team said, maybe make sure that they know that we're going to be talking about uncomfortable stuff, and that's okay. And so we were able to add in some more messages about that. As we're doing the development, this is also a really good time to pilot anything else. Always, always, always pilot. In Cybersenga, which is an internet-based HIV prevention program in Uganda, we piloted the use of laptops as a delivery mechanism. Where are we at in terms of knowing how to use the computer, knowing how to use the internet? How do we develop an internet-based prevention program for young people where they're at in their technology space? And it was so incredibly helpful. And Girl to Girl, there really weren't that many measures that had been developed for sexual minority adolescents. And so we did a pilot, and I'm so glad we did. In Project Shag, we just finished that pilot for the home-based HIV testing, and I'm so glad we did. So here's an example of some of the things that we learned in the pilot of the surveys that we did with Girl to Girl. We learned that abbreviations, particularly EG, are not universally understood by teens. They were like, we don't know what you mean here. So that was helpful. We had updated many questions. They also wanted to know questions about sex, if we were asking just about unwanted or all types of sex. And that was really important for us to know. Something else that I thought was super interesting was the incentive option. So we were doing, I think at the time we were offering Amazon gift card and a donation, and teens said, what if we don't want an incentive? And we thought, oh, it's helpful. So really take the time to pilot all these other things, to ask all the questions that you wish that you had time to ask. Now you have time to ask them. Here's an example of something else that we did in the pilot. We wanted to know, when we say these words, what do you think we mean? So boyfriend, girlfriend, 90% said, yeah, I think that those people were probably having sex in a committed relationship. Partner, the same. 76% said, when you say that, I think they're having sex in a committed relationship. But 2 and 3 said, I think it might be somebody you kiss, touch, or make out with, but you're not having sex. And so it was a really good opportunity for us to quantify how we might want to understand their understanding of these words. So once you do all that, then you do the alpha test, right? And this is the internal team test. And so if you're on my research team, you are consenting to me blowing up your phone for at least 8 weeks with all of the content that we have just developed. And it's incredibly, incredibly helpful and important. One of the things we learned in Guy to Guy was that introductions matter. When you're reading on screen, reading it in Word doc, it all sounds great. But once you finally get it on your screen, it was very clear that I would just start the day without the hello. I'd be like, just talking about sex and condoms all of a sudden. It was the first thing you see in the morning, and you're like, okay, I need a good morning first. So that was helpful to hear. And in other experiences in the moment, so sitting around a dinner table with friends and family and getting a message about dildos, what does that feel like? Right? Another example was in our control content, we talk about healthy eating, and it was around the holidays. And one of my team members was like, I don't want to hear about this right now. So just getting a better sense of what it's like and opportunities to improve it before you go into the beta test. Beta test is a pilot. When we did Stop My Smoking, we didn't have time to do the beta tests. We went straight into field. And then we realized that there were some really important tech research miscommunications around methodology, particularly when to randomize. We were randomizing at the point of consent as opposed to when the baseline survey was finished. We also discovered that the technology didn't work. When we did the internal team test, we did it like with the first sort of the main part, but we didn't follow it all the way through. And so we realized that there were some like pretty significant things that weren't working. And so we then fixed them, but reclassified those folks as being part of a beta test. I'm just going to do this really quickly. I managed to just spill all of my tea all over my desk with my wild gesticulations. Okay, so then the magic happens, right? Then you finally are ready for the RCT, and that's super exciting. And you know, the good news is that things tend to go pretty well once you do all of that formative work. So Bully Down is a bully prevention program for middle school students that we have pilot tested, and we get, you know, high acceptability, high feasibility. We tend to write control programs that try to blind the control program. And so what I like to see in the feasibility and acceptability is similar data so that the kids in the control think that they have learned the skills to do the thing. So in this case, they've learned the skills to reduce bullying, but our data, you know, our outcomes suggest that those in the intervention may actually have lower rates of bullying than those in the control group. These are outcomes for girl to girl. This is not my favorite slide, so I apologize. I was trying to figure out how to format it in a way that wasn't painful and didn't quite get there. But what you'll see is that at the end of the intervention, which is a 5-month experience, those in the intervention had rates of condom protected sex 1.5 times those of in the control group. And the relative odds of being currently on birth control, 1.6 times higher for those in the intervention than in the control. And also intentions to use birth control were significantly higher for intervention than control. Abstinence and intentions to be abstinent and intentions to use condoms were not different. And our programs tend to be healthy, positive sex positive. And so we typically don't really move the needle on abstinence. But one of the things I also was really pleased by was, while not statistically significant, our pregnancy rates appear to be lower in the intervention than control as well. This is some data from Cyber Senga in Uganda, where that shows that the control and we did a booster, and the booster seemed to be particularly impactful. So that was exciting. Stop My Smoking. Interestingly, we stratified by women and light smokers, and we had a pretty pronounced impact on cessation there. So I'm going to skip forward. This is really just a recap of what we just talked about, acknowledging my funding. And we'll now sort of hand it over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ybarra. That was such a wonderful presentation, and it I know for myself it hits really close to home with the Center for Digital Health. A lot of the work that we do is very similar. I want to highlight several points that you made, but one that really stuck out to me was really understanding your target audience and really understanding why the use of technology. It's not just this blanket solution at times, right? It really is understanding access, the digital divide, the ethics behind it. So I really want to that was one of your earlier points I wanted to share. Before we get to the questions, I have a question for you. What is that process in terms of doing the formative research, everything that I talked about in terms of focus groups and kind of making sure that it's acceptable and feasible, doing the RCT? How long is that process in kind of like that research world, and how do we take it from there, from research into kind of what I'm calling the implementation science space, that it doesn't require the IRB and it doesn't require the getting consent components, but it's like, here is an effective digital health intervention for the different topics that you mentioned that can be available to different heart populations. What is that process like, both time-wise as well as, I guess, the logistics of that?
Yeah, So some of it depends on who your funder is and how much time they'll give you. So, I think a year and a half is sort of a nice amount of time to get all the way through and be ready for the randomized controlled trial. Often funders or reviewers will want to see something a little bit more compressed, something closer to a year. But to do all of that work well, it's at least a year. It shouldn't take more than, it's not 2 years, but it's at least a year. Implementation science is interesting. And a lot of the questions that are typically asked don't actually often translate very well. Like when we think about the structural barriers, usually it's sort of institutional barriers. Well, the cool thing is I'm going around institutions, yay, right? And I'm going around parents, so yay. So I think one of the challenges is actually thinking about these tools that we now are using in implementation science. How can we adapt them so that we're actually asking the questions that we need to be asking when we're trying to implement these types of projects? And I also think that the development and the implementation can be separate, that's okay, that it's okay to do all of the development and still do the implementation science, that you don't have to forego that when you're doing implementation science. And in fact, maybe what you're doing is sort of the smaller project to do all of the development, and then the implementation science is when you're implementing. So Girl to Girl was really cool because one of the things that we were required to do at the end of the grant in the 5th year was to actually package the intervention and disseminate it. So it was an expectation of the funder that we would put it out there. So now Girl to Girl is a website, and teens can go and enroll themselves and go through this program for free, because that's what we did. And we actually then did research on research and did a mini effectiveness trial there. So I think there's opportunities to do implementation science, especially, if the funder is on board with it.
Great. Thank you. We're going to go to our questions from the chat here. If folks feel comfortable unmuting themselves and asking your question, Alyssa Gatto, if you're able to unmute. If not, I can read your question.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Here, hello. I just had a question about you said that you have gotten waivers for parental permissions from the IRB, and I've just had a lot of issues kind of getting the IRB to agree to that. And I'm wondering if there's particular language that you've used, because I also develop online interventions for high schoolers, and I don't really feel that the parents necessarily need to consent because it's a skill-based intervention and it's really about the teenager. But I'm wondering how you've been successful in getting the IRB to sort of move past that piece, knowing that the teen, I guess if it's, you talk about the harm or something else.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, there's quite a bit of variability in IRB still on this point. So if you email me, I can absolutely, I'll just copy and paste the language that I use. But there are, some regulations. So there's basically some thresholds that you have to meet, right? That IRBs have to be able to say, okay, well, this and that. And so it's about, oh gosh, Kim Nelson is on this call. I'm sure you can say something about it, but essentially it is about safety. It's about practicability. You need to have a plan to, sort of shore up any safety issues that are assumed to be there if parents are involved. I think it also helps to cite papers that have been published. We've done one, I know others have as well. So you can demonstrate to the IRB that this type of work, there is precedence, that they're not sort of on this legal cliff that sometimes they feel like they are.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. Anusha, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, yes. My question is specifically something you mentioned a little bit ago. You said that if you're mailing packages to participants who are minors and you're concerned about, or if they're concerned about like parents opening their packages or whatever, and then you would say that maybe the study is not a good fit at the time. Did you find that there was like a trend in the type of participants who would say that they were not comfortable having that package mailed to them? Or is there like a demographic or something?
Yeah, it kind of fell out the way that we expected. So younger kids, younger youth were more likely to be like, oh, yeah, this feels a little bit more than I can do. And older youth generally were more able to do it. So we piloted with 50 folks, 40 of whom were 18 years to 22 years, 10 of whom were under 18. So it's not that we weren't able to recruit the younger youth, but for sure they were harder to reach. And we said, so if it's not safe to get the package at home, is there another safe place? So they weren't required to get it at home, but they were required to have a safe space where they could get the package. And it was just an easier ask for older youth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Annie, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, John. Michele, it's a delight to see you. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm actually interested in hearing a little bit about your experience with TikTok and advertising on it. We've worked a lot on various social media platforms here at the Center for Digital Health, and TikTok is perhaps the only one that we have not ventured into. So I'd love to hear kind of about what the process is, how it differs from advertising on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, et cetera, Craigslist.
It is not great. It is not great. So in theory, they allow you to advertise to any age, right? So Snapchat is 18 and above. TikTok technically allows you to advertise with under 18s. What we have found is that they would somehow bill all of our ad budget for the day, and yet also flag our ad as not being consistent with their rules. So we actually, I think there was one ad that they allowed to run for like 20 minutes and we got a ton of clicks. It was very exciting, but then they shut us down. But they managed to bill us for and never gave us money back on multiple campaigns. I mean, I think all told, we were probably $350, $400 into it, but it was completely unsuccessful. I have a colleague who was able to do TikTok with 18 and above, and she was ecstatic. She's like, this is fantastic. I'm getting so much traffic. But then she got a scammer, and she's pretty sure that they came from TikTok. So I think if you can make it work, and those of us doing this work know that doing advertisements on Facebook and Instagram is so hard now. Like they've gotten rid of any, like you can target on gender and you can target on age. That's as well as you can do. And you can try and use with your advertising, with your language. We've had some success with that, but for all intents and purposes, it's hard. It's hard. Unfortunately, I don't think TikTok is the answer.
Bummer. I got all excited. I was like, oh, someone figured it out. Thank you.
And Dr. Barr, I'm curious to see what the next social media, the big, next social media platform is, right? Because, TikTok, it existed pre-COVID, but it expanded in terms of its use and reach. And we've, at the Center for Digital Health, we ask, we ask adolescents what predominant social media platforms they use, and 5 years later, the options that we offer, it's completely obsolete, and it dates us as researchers. So I can imagine as a fellow researcher, it's just how do we keep up to date, right? With different platforms. Yeah,
and where do you go to reach and engage them? And also, are those new platforms keep up? Like even just figuring out where and how to advertise on these newer platforms. Like there's like Snapchat. There were, for years, they were like, we're still figuring it out, come back soon. And then, then they made it an option, but there wasn't any, there was no help scaffolding it. So when it didn't work, there was no human being that you could talk to, because they just hadn't put the infrastructure in place to advertise there yet. So.
Absolutely. Cicely, if you are able to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, yes, I wanted to know more about the first question that was asked, which was about the implementation aspect, but also how is this explained to stakeholders? Are they people in public health, or and then in the same vein, how is this also explained or discussed with the target population and focus groups? Like, do you kind of lay out like, this is the framework that we're using and this is how we designed the program? Because you had mentioned that like different from what the experts thought, the target population is actually the expert themselves. So I just wanted to kind of know more about that. Thank you.
So implementation science, most of our funding comes from NIH. And while reviewers are interested in implementation science, it's really not reflected, I think, yet in the funding. And so it's not, I don't have to convince anybody that I'm going to disseminate this thing afterwards, which is a big reason why most of NIH funded work is never disseminated, right? So I think that that would be transformative if we encouraged NIH to hold researchers accountable for that. For us, we, because we're using text messaging and it's actually a pretty affordable technology to support once you've paid for all of the actual development stuff, the ongoing cost to send text messages to the 100 kids that have signed up for this program is affordable, and is something we actually are able to bundle into our operating costs. If we had something that so our web-based intervention was based on Flash, because that's how old that intervention is, and then Adobe stopped supporting Flash. Well, we don't have the money to go back and redesign that. So there are absolutely, ongoing costs that can be incurred based upon what you've chosen as your delivery mechanism that, I think it could be a conversation with a stakeholder about, what can this look like over time. So for the focus groups, we do tell them that we're asking them to help us design an intervention for, this particular, for guys like you, for example, and around a particular topic. And sometimes we'll often ask them about, the program components. So we'll ask about the topics and sort of what's going on with their lives. And then we'll move into, so these are some ideas that we have about how the program's going to work. What do you think about that? So they do know that there is kind of a larger reason why they're talking to us. I will say, so an example is one of the focus groups that we did with sexual minority cisgender girls. We were asking about, what would you tell somebody, a friend or somebody like you? And she came back with some great, quote that basically was like, move like your hips can move mountains, or walk like your hips can move mountains. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. Right. So that clearly was a message that I then integrated in content. And then we were doing the internal team test. One of the adults was like, oh, I don't think kids will know what this means. And I was like, oh, well, and then when we were doing the intervention for people with serious mental illness, talking to people with schizophrenia and, thinking about the coping skills that they were already aware of and what they were strategizing, what they were using versus clinicians. And clinicians were kind of like, we're not very good at doing this. And they kind of have trouble doing this. And then you talk to the patients and they're like, no, we do that all the time. So, that's another example of kind of dissonant views.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ybarra. And I apologize that looks like we have to wrap up. Sorry to the questions that we couldn't get to. We will post this recording and the slides on our website in about a week's time. Dr. Ybarra, thank you so much for joining the Center for Digital Health in our seminar series. We have learned so much from you, and I feel like our conversation could go beyond this hour. So I really, truly appreciate you joining us. To our audience members, this will be our last seminar for this calendar year of 2022. So we will be back in January of 2023. Please join the listserv if you want to hear more about our upcoming events. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope you have a good